All right. Hello, everybody. So this is one of the first days of the section of the course on extending moral considerability. So the central question here is what kinds of beings ought to enter into our moral considerations? For example, do plants matter morally? Do animals matter morally? Do future people matter morally? These are all relevant questions, and in traditional ethics their interests seem to be on the fringes of morality. And so how do we create an ethic, or can we plausibly create an ethic that includes their interest, such that it's wrong to kill them or wrong to harm them in ways that without good reasons? So just a little bit of vocabulary here. We might think about who matters morally as kind of a sphere, right? So we can think about short-term anthropocentrism. This view would be something like, look, the only people that matter are the are human beings that exist in the here and now, right? So we can do whatever we want to with animals. We can do whatever we want to with plants and ecosystems as well. And so those things don't come into our, or they don't need to come into our moral thinking. Uh, there's also long-term anthropocentrism, often called enlightened anthropocentrism. According to this view, is that present-day human beings matter, as well as human beings that will exist in the future. So the idea here is that we need to live in such a way as to not contribute to climate change, and not consume things that have contributed significantly to climate change. And we should also um, have a society that limits the number of resources that we use, such that future folks or future people will have enough of that whatever the resource in question is. And then we have syntheocentrism, for which Peter Singer will be our representative figure for this view. So, according to syntheocentrism, anything with sentience has moral considerability. So, this will be chickens, dolphins, cows, dogs, tigers, ligers, all of these sophisticated mammals, as well as like sophisticated reptiles and such. And so, according to this view, these things need to enter into our moral thinking. And according to Singer, they need to enter into our moral thinking uh, on equal footing, right? So killing a dog is like killing a human being. There's no way to morally differentiate between the two. Um, Kicking a dog is the same as kicking another person, and we'll see why he thinks that momentarily. And I'll go ahead and just sort of dog ear this. Is that he comes at this from a consequentialist framework. So you'll see in the reading, and you'll see in the lecture momentarily, that he's thinking about the pleasures and pains of different people and different individuals, so animals and such. um, those things therefore have interests, and so we need to respect their interests. And given that it's generally wrong to make something suffer, the suffering of a dog is of equal importance as the suffering of a human. Okay, and then we have ecocentrism and biocentrism, which we will also discuss a little bit with Leopold and with Sandler. Um, so biocentrism is the idea that life is the feature, not sentience, right? Not reason. Rather, life is the central feature that makes things matter morally. This is often cashed out in terms of beings having the interests of living things. So this is, for example, if I have a potted plant and I forget to water it, right? That's bad for the plant. Anything that can undergo self maintenance, and anything that has something that can go bad for it, that thing matters morally. Such that we need some reason to damage or to harm that thing. We can't just arbitrarily destroy a plant without any reason. And then lastly, there ecocentrism, which is the idea that ecosystems are the things that matter. So this is even broader than the biocentric view that says that individual plants matter. This is like the ecosystem as a whole matters. So these are just some general terms to think about the scope of what matters morally. Okay, so we can distinguish between intrinsic values and instrumental values. So something that is intrinsically valuable, um, generally speaking, is something that matters morally, right? So, um, for example, I matter as a human being. It doesn't matter what I do to anybody, right? It seems like we want to say that you matter, Spencer, right? I can't even if I were to do something really, really awful, right? I seem to matter, right? You can't do whatever you want to me just because I do something bad, right? And so, given that I have intrinsic value, it seems wrong to harm me. It seems wrong to beat me up or chop my head off or whatever. So, we can differentiate intrinsic value from instrumental value. So I have intrinsic value, but I also have instrumental value insofar as I'm offering this course to you all, right? And so I am, in a way, you are getting something from me that helps you attain a various goal, right? And so we might wonder, what do other things have intrinsic value other than human beings? Um, so we can think about a shovel, right? We might think like, why do we care about a shovel? Well, because it helps us dig holes, right? And it keeps us from having to like use our nails to dig a big hole, right? But that's like, but if it didn't do that, we might wonder why we would keep a shovel around, right? So it seems that a shovel merely has instrumental value. Okay, so thinking about animals from anthropocentric perspectives, animals are going to have mere instrumental value. They're going to be more like tools, right? They're going to be more like shovels, right? They're there to feed us. They're there to help us with work, right? And they're there for like other reasons that benefit us. Whereas a syntiocentric view is going to expand what is intrinsically valuable, and it's going to say that look, animals are intrinsically valuable because they have the ability to suffer, right? Or maybe they have some other feature that makes them intrinsically valuable, um, rather than merely instrumentally valuable. And then like the biocentric and ecocentric views are going to say that no, look, like plants are intrinsically valuable as well as whole ecosystems. They are intrinsically valuable as well. Okay, so let's talk about Peter Singer. So Singer wants to say that okay, he wants to say that the principle of equality, it follows, given the principle of equality, that morally speaking, we have to take into account the interests of animals. Okay. So the principle of equality says something like the following: when we have two beings that have the same interests, we have to consider both of those interests equally, right? For we can't just like arbitrarily pick one thing to prefer over the other, right? So if we have, say, two people of two different races, we know that roughly speaking, they have the like identical interests, right? Or many of the same interests. It would generally speaking be wrong to prioritize the interests of a person from of one race over that of another race, right? Okay. So what follows from the principle of equality? Well, this is um, there are two senses of equality that we can talk about. This is the principle of equality of treatment, and then the principle of equality of consideration, right? So Singer wants to say that we are using the principle of equality of consideration and not treatment, right? So if we're talking about equal treatment, that means that everything or everybody we have to give the same thing to, right? Whereas if we're talking about equality of consideration, that means that we have to think about and reflect on the interests of all of the beings. And then we can treat them differently according to their needs and according to their interests. So, for example, um, suppose that you have three children, one of whom has cancer, right? And you give that child chemotherapy, right? But suppose that your other two children don't have cancer. If you were to treat them all equally, you would have to give them all chemotherapy, right? That seems like a bad idea, right? So the idea is that, look, even though you're treating them differently because each of them has a different need, right? The one that has cancer has an interest in having chemotherapy, whereas the other two don't have that interest. The principle of equality of consideration says that you would give them chemotherapy, the two that don't have it, if they were to have cancer, right? And so you're considering all of their interests and making decisions based on those interests. So, um, so we might think of, or at least Singer wants us to think about the historical reasons for why we treated people unequally, historically speaking. Um, and so we might wonder, are there good reasons for treating people unequally in terms of consideration, not necessarily in terms of treatment? So Singer has this nifty term called speciesism. So, okay, so what's racism and what's sexism? Here's a working definition of both of these. Um, Racism is considering the interests of another person over and above the interests of another person merely on the basis of race, not on the basis of what each of their interests are, right? But merely on the basis of race. This is a bad reason, Singer wants to say, and I think he's right, for preferring the interests of one person over another. Similarly, sexism is preferring the interests of one gender or one sex over that of a person of a different gender or a different sex. So we we have um, two people that are arbitrarily different, and we prefer the interests of one over the other, right? And Singer wants to say that that's a bad reason, right? Okay, so what is speciesism then? So we have the members of one species, we have the members of another species. Singer wants to say that they share an interest, namely the interest to not suffer. And so that means that we should treat these interests equally. We should give each of them equal consideration to prefer that one species not suffer merely in virtue of being a member of a different species is arbitrary. And so that means that just like racism and just like sexism identified arbitrary reasons or bad reasons for differential practices or to prioritize one group over another, speciesism does the same thing because the members of each of these species have the same interests. That's the key here. So we can't treat humans better than animals because doing so is like a bad. We don't have any good reason for doing so because they can both suffer. Okay, so one of the assumptions that Singer makes is that in order to have an interest, you have to have consciously held preferences. You have to have the capacity to suffer, right? You have to have basically sentience in order to have interests, right? Okay, so um, given that human beings, and let's just say pigs, but will also represent any non human sentient creature, given that both of these sets of things can suffer, right? We have no reason to prefer the suffering of one over the suffering of another, at least not without good reason, right? Um, so, given all of this, it follows that generally speaking, it's wrong to treat animals to like arbitrarily harm other animals, right? So, but back to Singer's assumption here is that he wants to say that sentience or consciously held preferences are necessary to have interests. We're going to actually press in on this assumption in a couple of days when we think about the interests of plants. So if plants have interests, then that means that there's a problem for Singer's account of interests, namely because non-sentient things can have interests. Okay, so here is Singer's argument. Essentially, the idea is that we have to give equal consideration to humans and to non-humans on the basis that they can both suffer. To prefer one over the other is an arbitrary move, right? And so um, it follows that we have to treat animals and humans equally in the sense that we have to give each one consideration, right? In moral consideration. That is, we have to have some good overriding reason to harm those creatures. Um, so, for example, if a human attacks you in a dark alley, you might beat them up, right? Generally speaking, it's bad to beat somebody up, but given that it's a case of self-defense, that's a good candidate for an overriding reason um, that would make it morally permissible for you to beat that guy up, right? Similarly, we have to have good reasons to consider to harm animals as well. That's the essential claim here. Okay, and so if we have to do that, right? If it's the case that animals and people have we have to give them all equal consideration. If that's right, then that's going to have implications for some of our like kind of mundane practices, right? So it may be the case that eating meat is generally speaking quite wrong. Um, so we can argue about whether or not um, the pleasure of eating meat is a good enough reason to kill another creature, right? Um, it seems like not, right? So imagine that I really get I get a kick out of like beating up dogs, right? Just beating the crap out of dogs. If I were to just like beat up dogs randomly, even if they're not my own, I would likely be charged with um, I would likely be charged with like animal abuse, which is like a criminal offense, right? So it seems like if beating up a dog for no other reason than it gives me pleasure, right? Then why should I be able to kill a cow to eat its flesh because it gives me pleasure? It seems like if it's a bad idea in one context, it's also a bad idea in another context as well, right? So it may be that Singer's argument implies that generally speaking, like eating meat from the meat industry is wrong. It may also have implications for laboratory mice as well. So it depends on the product in question, right? And it depends on the what the outcome of that product is going to be, as opposed to the number of mice that have to die, right? Or that have to suffer. But for example, if we have to test the nail polish on a rabbit, we got to put the nail polish in the rabbit's eye, maybe that's not a good reason to subject the rabbit to that kind of discomfort. And so if we have to consider um, both of their interests equally, right? Then it may be that our interest in having nail polish does not outweigh the interest of the rabbit uh, not to suffer. So, and then finally, it might have implications for keeping animals in captivity at zoos as well. So we can think about whether or not pleasure is a good overriding reason for causing harm to another animal. So anyway, I invite you to think about that more. And I also invite you to seriously question whether or not your meat eating practices, if you do eat meat, are morally permissible.